Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. We've talked in the past about the administrative state. That is the zoological term for the swamp. The unelected, unresponsive bureaucrats who have lifetime appointments to jobs that you never hear about and often are handed the keys to the candy shop by our legislative representatives because they want to be seen as doing something about whatever the perceived problem is. Republicans have their menu, Democrats have the other, and they just say to these agencies, do this for me. And they hand them the keys and say, do this for me. And they have, in many cases, law writing authority. There's a great book out. It's by Peter Wallison, who is senior fellow and Arthur Burns Fellow on Financial Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And he's just penned a book called Judicial Fortitude, and how this may be our last chance to rein in the administrative state. Peter, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
Well, I'm well. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it is the part of this that I don't think anyone gets is that, we keep rearranging the deck chairs in our legislative chambers, yet the gray edifice of the bureaucracy continues to grow unabated until 2 years ago, where we've started to see regulations at least start to diminish, at very least through some attrition. We've seen some of the employment in the swamp go down. But talk about why you think the judicial branch is our best and perhaps last chance way to rein in this out-of-control bureaucracy.
The problem is that the agencies of the administrative state, which include all of the agencies of the federal government, starting with the major cabinet agencies like the Treasury Department, all the way down through hundreds and hundreds of other agencies with powers that were given them by Congress, are not controlled in any meaningful way either by Congress or by the president. Mm-hmm. For example, each year since 1993, these agencies have produced 3,000 rules and regulations each year for a total of about 101,000 rules and regulations in 25 years. Now, how is that possible? Why is that happening? We know that under the Constitution, no agency has any power, including the president. No one in the executive branch has any power without a statute passed by Congress, which gives them that power. Mm-hmm. Congress makes the law under the Constitution, and those laws are what empower these agencies and empower the president. But if you interpret these laws in a way that extends the power of the agency, that is, if the agency is given the authority to say, well, yes, the language of the statute is this, but what Congress really meant was something broader, then the agency can extend its power tremendously, and Congress correspondingly then loses a lot of its power because it has handed it over, in effect, to the agency. Now, why does the agency have this power to determine the scope of its statutory authority? And that comes from a case in the Supreme Court, decided by the Supreme Court in 1985, called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council. And in that case, the court said to all the lower courts, you should not look at the statute that is empowering this agency. If a case comes before you involving the power of an agency, you should defer to the agency's interpretation of its powers. And that's what the lower courts have been doing since 1984. By 1993, they were in a position to start using statutes that had been passed well before then to make new laws and rules and regulations. And they have continued to do that through today. So the reason that they have this power is that it came from a decision of the Supreme Court in 1984, and today's Supreme Court, fortunately, with 5 constitutionalists on the court now, with Kavanaugh having finally been confirmed, today's court can reverse that decision in Chevron or substantially modify it. And if that happens, then all of the courts following the Supreme Court will start looking at the very words of the statutes that Congress has provided in authorizing these agencies to act. And in doing that, the agencies will be stopped from growing beyond what Congress actually produced.
Peter, you lay it out beautifully right there, but won't we need a plaintiff? Won't we need somebody to bring the case in the first, circuit court somewhere to say, I've been harmed under this behavior, and then work it through the courts, or has that process already begun?
Well, it's probably already begun, but we'll have no shortage of plaintiffs. I'm a lawyer myself, and I must say that what happens when a lawyer meets his clients or talks to his clients about their concerns about a particular regulation is many lawyers in the past will have said to their clients, look, I agree with you. I think the agency has gone too far. But the Supreme Court's decision in Chevron versus NRDC, that decision means that the courts are going to look at the agency's interpretation of the statute and defer to that, rather than my interpretation or what a court might normally say about what the agency, what powers have been given to the agency. So a lot of people then just said, okay, well, my lawyer tells me it's not worth fighting, we're going to lose. Now, with a new Supreme Court and 5 people on the court who have expressed in the past their concern about this Chevron case, I think many, many lawyers will now be advising their client, look, if you want to bring a case against this rule, I think we have a chance of winning if we get to the Supreme Court, and even if we get simply to the lower courts, because they will now be looking at the Supreme Court as being much more hostile, if you will, to this Chevron decision.
Well, we've also chronicled the amount of lower court judges that President Trump has appointed in the last 2 years, and has in many cases had Justice Kavanaugh being one of them, flown through Senate confirmations. Take us into, and I'm just curious to, the thinking of the Supreme Court in 1984 that would see this as constitutional. What cunning bit of legerdemain was pulled upon these folks to make something that a radio show host can hear is unconstitutional to think that they were? Was it just legislating from the bench in an early form?
Well, no, intellectual history is very important here, and the book actually contains some discussion of this. The idea began during what was called the Progressive Era in the United States between 1880 and 1920, that we really should be governed more by well-educated, credentialed, disinterested people. Woodrow Wilson, who became president in 1912, actually was a leader of this group and wanted to modify the Constitution substantially to give more power to administrative agencies.
Technocrats.
But, Democrat. But
technocrats. That was the technocracy movement, okay.
That's right, a technocrat. And again, technology is a big argument here, and other things are arguments that say, Congress really doesn't know much about all this stuff. The really important decisions have to be made by these credentialed, intelligent, disinterested people in administrative agencies. That idea came out of the Progressive era between 1880 and 1920, and then was picked up again in the New Deal. And in the New Deal, it really flourished, with many, many more agencies being established, and then in between 1937 and 1941, President President Roosevelt, FDR, had the opportunity to appoint all of the Supreme Court justices. Mm-hmm. And they set into the law the idea that we ought to pay much more attention to what the agencies are saying about the statutes that they are implementing than what the courts are saying about what Congress actually authorized. Mm-hmm. And that finally became, ultimately, in 1984, a decision saying flat out, if the agency believes that it has this authority, you, the court, must accept that. You must defer to that unless you regard it as unreasonable. And courts generally are not good at saying what is reasonable or unreasonable. They look at the statute, and if the agency has a different interpretation of the statute, and they have been directed to defer to the agency, they will let the rule go through.
And I should remind it for my political partisan friends that I'm looking at the construct of the court at the time under Warren Burger, and almost all of them at the time were appointed by Republican presidents, with the exception of Whizzer White, it looks like, and Thurgood Marshall, who on occasion would sway conservatively, at least in certain cases. So don't just say, oh, the Republican is packed the court with people, because these were the folks who voted for this. Now, I want to follow up, and again, we're visiting with the author of Judicial Fortitude, Peter Wallison, from the American Enterprise Institute, and how this is an opportunity judicially to rein in the administrative state. It seems like, and maybe it's correlation more than causation, but it seems like the elected officials have taken upon this ruling in 84 to then say, well, I've got a hall pass now. I can write overly vague regulations saying that I'm Congressman who's this and I want the water to be clean. Here, EPA, here's your orders to make the water clean however you want to do it. And we wind up with the administrative state saying a puddle on your property means that your entire farm is a wetland and now you can't farm on it anymore. I know that those are extremes, but that seems to be what's happened lately.
Yeah, I think that's entirely what's happened lately. A lot of authority has been given by Congress. Congress has discovered that it can write what I call goals legislation. Yeah, and that means you just set the goal, and you let the agency then implement the goal. But that means the agency has to make all the tough decisions, such as how far does the law extend? Does it extend to farm ponds or streams that run through suburban properties, or what is it? Yeah. These kinds of decisions had to be made by Congress, because these are important decisions as to the liberty of the American people and their use of their own property, and Congress did not make these decisions. And what Congress has discovered is that, by and large, after they make a law in which they give the power to an agency to do all these things, when their constituents approach them and say, Congressman, why is it that the government is trying to control what's on my farm, what I do with my farm pond? The congressman can say, oh, well, wait a minute, I didn't vote for that. That's the agency. Yeah. But in fact, he did. That congressman did vote for that by giving the power to the agency to make those decisions.
I think it's called the having your cake and eating it too process. And
you got it.
Those out of control agency that I keep sending money to. Look, a baby wolf. Peter, so again, take us through the process. So at some point, somebody is going to have to be the aggrieved case. Somebody has to be Nelson Mandela in this case to say, hey, I've suffered under whether it be environmental regulation or educational regulation. Something is going to have to push back on one of these agencies. Now, is there and maybe this is coming out of both of our milieus here, but is there a political concern that given the fact that the executive branch is now a Republican and maybe both the House and the Senate are Republicans, that by doing this you would make a Republican majority in the House and the Senate and the president look bad by saying your Department of Betsy DeVos can't do this anymore, or Scott Pruitt can't do this anymore, and then therefore it would, at counter purposes to a conservative majority in Washington?
Well, I think the Republicans, almost all Republicans, are going to agree that the less government there is, the better off we all are. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Betsy DeVos would mind if she was not able to take some steps that she would have wanted to control the education department more. Her effort is going to be, and has been since she was appointed to office, her effort has been to pull the department back from a lot of the things it's doing. And the problem is that even the president and even a cabinet member cannot control the things that are done each year by all these agencies, even the agencies within a department, because there isn't any time to review all these regulations and determine whether they are consistent with the statutory authority that the agency has. Think about that. 3,000 rules every year. The president can't review those. His staff can't review those. Congress can't review those. The only way that it can be attacked is for people who are made subject to these regulations to take them to court and have the courts look at the statutory language and say, this was not authorized by Congress. And I think that is what the book is about, how you would rein in the administrative state agencies through use of the courts. And if you can get one decision by the Supreme Court, that affects the way all of the courts behave.
Well, and it certainly then, gives them the opportunity to go back to it. What about the people who would say, well, that's too much for 435 congressmen and 100 senators to possibly oversee? That's way too much work. It's inefficient. We could never do anything. My answer would be, of course, good. The less you do, the better. I presume, Peter, from the American Enterprise Institute's viewpoint, that's also a good thing, that if they can't do it because it's just too much, then they can, I don't know, something crazy like put it back on the states to do?
Well, I don't know how it will be handled, but the fact is that we are a democracy, and the decisions have to be made by a party, by a body that is elected by the people. We're a democratic republic. Mm-hmm. And so this is not really a choice. I don't think we can say, well, this is really too complicated for Congress to do. They don't have the time. They don't have the staff. All these arguments, fine. You can make all these arguments, and many of them are actually true. The problem is that if we are, in fact, a democratic republic, our representatives have to make the tough decisions.
Amen.
And so if the tough decisions are hard to make, if they're tough to make electorally, and if they're hard to make technically, and if they're hard to make morally, they still have to be made by our elected representatives and not by a bunch of people unelected in Washington, D.C., who know nothing about the views of the people throughout the United States.
I grew up in New York City, Peter, and I've watched Donald Trump build pretty much every building he ever built, whether it's a golf course, a casino, or even some of the early ones. And as you talk, I'm thinking perhaps this is the one person in American politics that would be free of the concern as to what it means to whatever legacy. I can think of just about every politician that I've ever known. Some have run for president, some have run for governor, and I can just hear each one of them, Democrat and Republican alike, saying, well, I don't want to be the guy that has to answer for you took away the EPA. And I've talked to folks who have worked in the deep state or the swamp and said, oh, well, you can't close up some of these redundant agencies. I think it was Office of Management and Budget about 5-6 years ago said there were millions and millions of dollars in absolutely 100% redundant agencies that just still exist after a new one was invented to make a politician look good along the line. EPA being a great example. I think it's the Department of Interior Quality or something like that that had existed for a century before EPA was invented. They both still get a budget line and they both have employees and something. But nobody wants to be the guy that has to face re-election being said, he's ruining the economy because he closed this agency. I'm struck that Trump is the guy that wouldn't care one way or the other. And maybe he's uniquely qualified to administer an era when this happens.
Well, yeah, and I do think he is able to take the heat. And I think this Supreme Court is able to take the heat too. I think these five people, including Thomas and the Chief Roberts, as well as Alito, and then of course Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Those five guys are strong believers in the framers' Constitution, and so that's why the book is called Judicial Fortitude, because there will be tremendous blowback against them if they take some of the steps that I'm recommending. But the word fortitude came out of an article. This was called a Federalist paper, authored by Alexander Hamilton at the time that the framers were trying to persuade the American people to ratify the Constitution. And what he said is that the courts were the guardians of the Constitution. They were supposed to guard the separation of powers. And to do that, they're going to need fortitude, because there will be tremendous efforts on the part of the elected branches to change the Constitution and turn it in a different direction. If the courts maintain fortitude, they will be able to preserve the Constitution over time. And we're faced with that problem today.
Peter, last question for you, and you mentioned Chief Justice Roberts, and that was where I was going with my last question anyway, was do you hold hope that he would vote in that? We watched him capitulate on the Affordable Care Act ruling. I'm sure many of our listeners are looking at the radio right now saying, I don't trust Justice Roberts to get this. Do you, and why?
Here's why, because, you see, justices have different obligations and views, of course. They're not all believing the same thing at the same time.
Right.
But on this question of separation of powers, Justice Roberts has, in many cases, said that he is concerned about this Chevron case.
Okay.
And so, in fact, I have several of his statements in my book where he has made clear that it is just exactly what Alexander Hamilton said back in the late 1800s. He said it's not just that we have to look at the Constitution. We are responsible for making sure that each of the bodies that were created within the Constitution, Congress and the executive branch, remain within their special places, the places that were provided for them in the separation of powers. That's one of the things we have to do, and that's something that Roberts has said only a few years ago. So he's on board, I think, with this issue.
Well, I appreciate your visit. What's the best place, Amazon, or should they go to AEI.org to get the book, Judicial Fortitude, Peter?
Amazon. AEI doesn't sell books.
Okay, I wasn't sure if they had a page for that or anything like that, but Amazon.com, look it up. It is called Judicial Fortitude, Christmas gift-giving lists. It's never too early to mention that, and I do greatly appreciate your visit on this. It's great, great stuff, and it is one of those, sure, nobody's thinking about it because it doesn't get on CNN. Then again, most things don't get on CNN anymore.
You won't see me on CNN.
Yeah, but you should be for this. You should be, Peter. Thank you so much for your visit, and thanks for joining us on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks very much, Joe.
Coming up next, we talk 2019 a little bit with Stephen Hayner, Senior Fellow for State and Local Tax Policy with the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy on tax hikes staring down the barrel of 2019 at you here in the Commonwealth on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And joining us now from the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy, Steve Hayner. Stephen, welcome to the program. Thanks for taking some time out with us. How are you doing this weekend?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. I appreciate you inviting me.
Just in the Richmond Times, a piece regarding 4 tax hikes that are going to be coming up in Virginia's future. And now, certainly, we look ahead towards 2019, and these are things that are going to be debated. And what things are the listeners going to need to be looking out for to fight back against these tax hikes should they wind up coming towards Virginia that could dissuade them from actually hitting us in the pocketbook?
Well, of the 4 pieces I discussed in that op-ed article in the Times-Dispatch, only one has actually been approved and is already being imposed, and that's those hospital provider fees which the legislature is using to pay the state share on the Medicaid expansion.
Right.
So the others are still things that the General Assembly might be able to do something about. Now, one of the others is this carbon tax, which is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is an effort to fight climate change and basically use the carbon tax to discourage the electric companies from using coal and using fossil fuels.
And just the way the original Obama climate exchange plan had been back when it was first proposed on a nationwide level.
It was proposed on a nationwide level. The northeastern states created their own compact called RGGI, and Governor Northam wants to join RGGI, and he's doing it through a regulatory process, not the General Assembly. The General Assembly actually has passed bills trying to stop Virginia's membership in RGGI, but the governor has vetoed them, and of course he has enough votes in the legislature to sustain any veto. So it's sort of happening by regulatory fiat as opposed to the legislative action. And whether or not the legislature could stop it, I don't know. But they have tried, and I suspect they will try again. Mm-hmm. The one that most people don't really understand, of course, are all the state impacts from these federal changes. This conformity business, where Virginia conforms with the federal tax code, the federal government changes the rules. Virginia then usually automatically changes the rules to match. But because Virginia has not cut any tax rates, a lot of folks are going to see their taxes go up next year. So that's the one that is definitely in the legislature's focus. That's something they can do something about. And I think that's something individual voters, individual taxpayers need to understand and speak up and talk to their local legislator about what's going on and what they'd like to see happen.
Now, certainly, the General Assembly coming in January, there's going to be some impact to the elections of some of the members to the U.S. House of Representatives in midterms. And so there could be changes there, and even it could create a bigger problem with conservative members like Ben Klein leaving the House and now being replaced. We could see an instance where even the narrow margin that the House is in Republican hands could be erased in special elections with very little time to ramp up for it. Do you hear anything out of any of the members that this could be a campaign issue for 2019 when all the seats are up for election?
Well, if for 2019, I very much expect it to be a campaign issue. I don't know that it will be in the special elections. We've got Jennifer Wexton going to Congress, which will create an opening in the state Senate. And actually everybody sort of expects a current Democrat legislator in the House to run for that seat, Jennifer Boykin. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I may have gotten that name wrong. And then Boysko, Jennifer Boysko. And then in Mr. Klein's seat, I'm not sure who's out there in terms of running on the Republican side, but looking at the results in that district, looking at the results in Mr. Riggleman's district, that ought to be a Republican seat to hold. That shouldn't be too much of a problem to hold that. So I think you'll go into the legislature 51-49, right where we are. what we were this past session. So it'll be very thinly balanced Republican control in the House.
But in any event, there's not going to be a lot of ramp-up time. But by the time they get a special election figured out, and then if it is a member of the House moving to the Senate for Wexton, then it's another special election.
Well, those of us who used to do this for a living behind the scenes, they're probably better organized than you realize.
Oh, I'm sure they've already got it figured out.
They've got the dates picked out and everything, I'm sure. But I think for 2019, and that's one reason I wrote the piece about, because nobody really had focused on the fact that we weren't talking about this tax increase or that tax increase. We were talking about 4 different things going on, all of which raise taxes, and it's the cumulative impact that really matters.
Let's start with the one that's currently in play, which is the Medicaid expansion, which I think is going to have an impact in 2019 because there were members who, pardon the hackneyed old expression, flip-flopped on, Medicaid expansion is the worst thing ever until all of a sudden they decided they were for it. Do you expect that this is something that's going to have an impact Senate-wise, whether it be Emmett Hanger or some of the other leaders in the Change of Mind coalition, if you want to call them that, regarding this, the Medicaid expansion monies that are going to be hitting us in these hospital costs?
Again, I'm not all that plugged into who might be preparing to run a primary against some of those folks, but I do expect some primaries in some key locations, and I expect the issue will be front and center. Those folks. And I understand some of the reasoning and don't disagree with some of the reasoning, but those folks who made that vote are going to have to be able to defend it and explain it. And one thing a lot of us were concerned about was the cost, and the cost is turning out already to be a little higher than they estimated, and I suspect it will continue to be higher than they estimated.
When you see the income tax hit based on the federal changes as well, had anyone raised the klaxon about that as it was coming out of Washington? Like, hold on, this in a federalist society, obviously we're going to be holding the bag for it unless we cut as well.
There was very little discussion of that in the General Assembly in January, and certainly very little discussion in December as the bill passed in Congress and the president signed the bill. And those of us who have done tax issues for years, we knew this was the case. Mm-hmm. We knew Virginia was a conformity state, and all the conformity states would have to do something to react to this, or else they would end up with an automatic tax increase. You can cut rates, you can change the deductions, you can. There's lots of things you can do, but doing nothing produces higher taxes. And during the General Assembly, when I would bring it up with people just as a private conversation, they would say, "Well, we don't know what the impact is. It's very complicated. We've got a study going on to check the impact, and we can deal with it later. We can deal with it. We can get it done later in the year." So they just sort of punted during the session.
You also bring up in your column the internet collections, remote taxes, which I remember from the beginnings of Bob McDonnell's administration was how he was going to pay for the rewiring of the Virginia Department of Transportation funding. And I still have the clip of Bob Goodlatte saying, well, nobody asked us in Congress if we were going to authorize internet sales tax collections. And I really thought, I said, well, gee, if only there was a Republican for Virginia that Bob McDonnell could have called before he went forward and did this. And I understand a lot of it was through the General Assembly's attempts to, quote, help Bob McDonnell rejigger the way VDOT is funded. Talk about this one, because it still, I think, surprises a lot of people that this is already agreed upon, that this is going to happen. And this is a Supreme Court ruling, correct? Well, again, the Supreme Court, let's go back a few years. When Governor McDonnell and people before Governor McDonnell were talking about this issue, almost no internet seller collected sales tax. Virtually every time you went on Amazon, Wayfair, any of those folks, and you bought something, no sales tax was imposed. About 4 years ago, I'm not sure exactly when, Amazon started, sort of voluntarily doing it. They started collecting sales tax, and partly it's because the way the law works, and if you have a facility in a state, if you have a legal nexus in a state, if you have a store, if you have a warehouse,
shipping facility, then by law you do have to collect the sales tax for that state. And Amazon was growing a lot more brick and mortar presence, so they just started collecting it. Once Amazon started doing it, it became much more common. So 6, 7, 8 years ago, very few were doing it. Now there's not that many left that aren't, and those that are left are smaller. So what the Supreme Court did was overturn an old precedent called Quill, and said you don't have to have that physical presence. You don't have to have that brick and mortar store, that warehouse, that actual facility. But Virginia, in order to collect this, Virginia still has to do some things. They have to pass some bills. So I don't think it is automatic. I think the legislature is going to have to take some steps in order to make it happen. But again, it's probably not as big an impact on people as it would have been 5 years ago.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I know that one of the members of the state Senate has proposed an income tax cut. I think, if I'm just remembering, it may have actually been a sales tax cut to match the internet sales increase to create, or to at least create the visual of a zero-sum game.
Right.
In that, is that got any traction, or is that just something that's going to get some attention?
I don't think it has a lot of traction. Frankly, I think what has traction is that they want to do it. I think they want the money, and you've got a number of legislators, including great folks like Bill Stanley out there, who's pretty conservative on a lot of things. But Bill Stanley's out there saying he'd like to see that money applied to building schools, and I think they've spent the money about 5 times over already, and they haven't even collected the first time.
That's always the best thing about
and again,
tax policy.
From a philosophical standpoint, I understand the objection, but if I ran a store in downtown Richmond, if I ran a store in downtown Emporia, and I was losing all these sales to people who could go online and not pay tax, I'd be calling my legislators saying, yeah, tax those guys. I got to pay it. They need to pay it too. So I see the argument on both sides.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But there's also the compliance cost to a business that does sell online of, I think it's something like 200 different taxing authorities.
Supreme Court, one of the things the Supreme Court did was tell the states if they want to do this, they should set a de minimis. They should set a threshold, so that if the business is not doing, say $100,000 of business in the state of Virginia, then they don't have to do it. So it's really the big guys they're after, not the small mom and pop. The small mom and pop will probably still be exempt from having to collect the sales tax.
We're visiting with Stephen Hainer, Senior Fellow in State and Local Tax Policy at the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy. He's written an op-ed. We're going to put a link to it up on the podcast of this and share it in our social media as well here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And we were talking a little bit in the first bit about philosophical, and certainly we understand that there are costs to governing a municipality of any kind, state, local. So there are those who say, well, you shouldn't have any taxes. Taxes aren't spelled out, this, that, or the other thing. And I don't think we're there. I think what a lot of our listeners speak up about is the idea that the more sliced these taxes are, the less transparent they become, Steve, that, you're going to get a penny here and a penny there and a penny here and a penny there instead of a dime in one much more transparent way.
Yes.
Is that something you see as well?
Oh yes, and that's sort of what's going on with the examples that I provided. You will never see that regional greenhouse gas carbon tax. That will be buried on your Dominion bill, on your APCO bill. You will never see the Wayfair tax, the sales tax collected on a remote sale. Because people don't really look that closely at the bill. Mm-hmm. So if they get it shipped in from Amazon, they don't really study the invoice. They might not realize that another 6% tax has been added to the price, and the one dealing with the Medicaid, the hospital provider. I mean, you want to try and figure out where it is on a hospital bill? Good luck.
Yes, I thought I paid this doctor,
and the hospitals initially probably will not pass it along directly, but it's just economics. I mean, the time will come when a tax gets paid by a human being, because only human beings can pay taxes.
Right.
So it'll come out of somebody's pocket, but again, you'll never find it. So that is part of the problem. Yes, the government can be very good at finding ways to collect taxes that you cannot track.
You mentioned very good Republican conservative folks like Bill Stanley, who sometimes talk like they've already spent that money before it's even started to be collected, and that's to me, I think, the biggest danger in intransparency in tax policy is that there really isn't any compunction for an elected official of any political party to say, yeah, we probably shouldn't do this. I remember a story. Former member of the Senate went to the U.S. House of Representatives, Stephen, and said in Richmond there's always, you get a little of what you want, I get a little of what I want, but in Washington, compromise means you get everything you want, I get everything I want, and we figure out how to pay for it later. Virginia's starting to go that way.
Well, I think, sadly, I think yesterday, the argument was settled in Virginia is the southernmost northern state, not the northernmost southern state.
Yeah,
that's sort of the way I feel waking up, looking at the results this morning. After all, but I think, one of the reasons I like working at the state level and would never really go work in Washington is at the state level. At least there is a certain level of rationality. I mean, Virginia cannot go deeply into debt. It cannot print money. Mm-hmm. It is required to maintain that balanced budget is required. And because they love the AAA bond rating, the AAA bond rating does force some discipline on them, does force them to keep some reserves. So working at the state level, it is a little more rational than the federal level. I'm not quite sure we're as bad as Congress yet. But
no, I don't think that's humanly possible unless you wanted to be a northern state. Let me ask you this though. Then, one of the problems with this is that I think Virginia's priorities start to get skewed. We talk about hospital taxes, we talk about the carbon taxes, and sometimes in an effort to get support from across the aisle, triggers are put in and provisos are written into these tax codes that keep them from being general fund, and then they get siloed into one thing, and we wind up overfunding one part of the government where another part gets kind of choked off for a lack of revenue, and I think that's a problem for Virginia sometimes, is that we don't prioritize our tax policy, our budgeting, and our spending side of it.
I'm going to use your show to give a little plug to a place where I do a lot of writing. You mentioned the Thomas Jefferson Institute, but I also do a lot of writing for a public policy blog called Bacon's Rebellion.
Oh, yes.
BaconsRebellion.com. And Bacon and I go back 40 years. I've known him since our days at the Roanoke Times. So I write for that on a regular basis now as a contributing editor. I did a piece on something called the Literary Fund, which is long forgotten. And Virginia has this special fund that basically takes all the fine money and all the certain revenue streams pour into something called the Literary Fund, which is by Constitution. It's one of those constitutional lock boxes. It's all education. You can't spend it on anything but education. But what it was supposed to be used for is building schools. It should have been the source of revenue for schools, and instead it's being used to pay for teacher retirement, which is fine.
Yeah,
but again, it takes the pressure off. You don't really know where the teacher retirement money is coming from. It's sort of hidden down in that literary fund. So, yeah, they do play some of those games in Richmond, and part of the problem, I think, is that there's just not enough focus, not enough attention, not enough transparency, which to some extent is shame on them, but to some extent is shame on us.
Oh, yeah.
We need to pay more attention, and we need to be asking more tough questions.
Well, and you mentioned retirement. The VRS is one of the great examples of it, and Jim has written and covered quite a bit at Bacon's Rebellion, and the issues with retirement, and sometimes being that, okay, we're going to spend this later, so we're going to call it retirement fund, so we don't have to worry about funding it right now, and somewhere down the road after we've gone off and taken some job at a university somewhere, somebody will have to figure out how to fund the retirement funds, and that's another problem Virginia tends to have, is we rearrange the deck chairs very nicely, and sometimes some of them have to be stuffed into a lifeboat, metaphorically speaking.
Well, and that's somewhat human nature. I mean, that's kind of the way the world works sometimes. But the VRS is very important to the Hainer household because my wife 32 years in the classroom, so that's a big chunk of her retirement fund. So, I commend the folks who take the time to do the research, to ask the tough questions, to come to the meetings, because And the reality is, and I mentioned Jim Bacon and I were newspapermen together 40 years ago, but the reality is the newspapers do not have the kind of personnel they used to have.
No, they don't.
So there's a lot of stuff that goes on out there, and one of the things I'm trying to do on Bacon's Rebellion is cover stuff that our local newspaper, the Times-Dispatch, might be missing.
And we
Because
appreciate
they like people. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the hardest thing, is that the economics of it, and it really comes back down to the people who are either listening to the radio programs or buying the newspapers. Is that we have to realize that you wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I was listening to my Spotify account every day, and there was no local radio station anymore. I was getting my news from Yahoo News, and now there's no local paper anymore. And what do you mean? I don't know what my tax rates are?" And that's something we need to take a thought about. But I think it comes from the citizens, and it comes from that advocacy. Stephen, thank you so much for what you do. Again, we're going to put the link to this up there, Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy, but your op-ed for the Richmond Times there as well, and Bacon's Rebellion as well, a great blog as well. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
My pleasure. Call anytime.
And thank you all for listening. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.